Hello everyone, my name is Khairunnas as one of the adjudicators for Philips debate competitions. Well, today I would like to give you the post-debate analysis with the motion this House would legally bind children to take care of their parents once the parent is old age. First, before I provide to you what kind of argument that you should put to the debate, I would like to give you what kind of question that should be answered. Well, there's five questions that I already provide in the screen. The first is what are the ethical implications of legally binding children to take care of their parents? Is it fair to impose this responsibility on children or should it be left on the individual choice? Second, how would such a law be enforced? What penalty would be imposed on children who fail to take care of their parents? And how would this penalty be enforced? The third, what are the economic implications of legally binding children to take care of their parents? Will this put an undue burden on younger generation who may already be struggling to support themselves financially? Four, what are the cultural and social implications of legally binding children to take care of their parents? How would this law impact traditional family structure and values? And the last question is, how would this law impact relationship between parent and children? Would it create resentment or strain in this relationship, especially if the child is forced to take care of a parent who was abusive and neglectful in the past? Well, for that question, I would like to provide to you what kind of argument that can be brought for both sides, government and opposition. For the first question, what are the ethical implications of legally binding children to take care of their parents? Is it fair to impose this responsibility on children, or should it be left to individual choice? For the government, may argue that legally binding children to take care of their parents in is an ethical obligation based on the principle of filial piety, which is deeply ingrained in many cultures around the world. This principle holds that children have a moral duty to respect and care for their parents, who have sacrificed a great deal to raise and support them. Therefore, is it fair uh, to impose this responsibility on children as it reflects a fundamental value of family and community? However, on the other hand, opposition may argue that while filial piety is an important value, it should not be legally enforced. Individuals should have the freedom to choose whether or not to take care of their parents based on their personal circumstance and relationship. Forcing children to take care of their parent may create resentment, strain relationship, and ultimately be counterproductive to the well-being of both parties. So that's the argument that can be brought by both government and opposition to answer the first question. And for the second question, how would such a law be enforced? What penalty would be imposed on children who fail to take care of their parents, and how would this penalty be enforced? For the government may argue that law in For the government may argue that law could be enforced through a system of legal penalty, such as fines or imprisonment, for children who fail to take care of their parents. They may argue that such penalties are necessary to ensure that the law is taken seriously and the elderly parents are not left without support. The government team may also argue that there could be provisions in the law for exceptions in cases where children are unable to provide care due to financial or other circumstances. In the opposition, may argue that enforcing such a law would be difficult and potentially counterproductive. The opposition may argue that it's not fair to punish children for failing to provide care, particularly if they are unable to do so due to financial or other constraints. The opposition team might also argue that the law may create resentment and strain relationship between parents and children, ultimately leading to less support for elderly parents. They may argue that alternative solutions, such as providing financial or social support for elderly parents, should be explored instead. Well, next to the third question, what are the economic implications of legally binding children to take care of their parents? Would this put an undue burden on younger generation who may already be struggling to support themselves financially? For the government, they may argue that legally binding children to take care of their parents would help to reduce the burden on the state and social welfare system. The government may argue that elderly care is a growing problem in many countries and that the cost of providing care is becoming increasingly unsustainable. By legally binding children to take care of their parents, the government can shift some of the responsibility and financial burden from the state to families. For the opposition team might argue that legally binding children to take care of their parent would create an undue burden on younger generation, who may already be struggling to support themselves financially. The opposition may argue that younger generation are facing increasingly difficult economic circumstances, such as high level of debt and unemployment, and that legally binding them to provide care for their parents would exacerbate this problem. The opposition team might also argue that the state has a responsibility to provide social welfare and support for the elderly, rather than relying on the families to provide care. For the next question, the four, what are the cultural and social implications legally binding children to take care of their parents? How could this law will impact traditional family structures and value? For the government team may argue that legally binding children to take care of their parents would reinforce traditional family values and structure. The government may argue that filial piety is an important cultural value in many societies, and that legally binding children to take care of their parents will have to preserve this value. The government may also argue that caring for the elderly parents is an important part of the family life, and that legally binding children to take care of their parents would help to strengthen the family bonds. In the opposition team side of the house may argue that legally binding children to take care of their parents will have negative cultural and social implications. They may argue that the law could undermine personal freedom and autonomy, particularly for a younger generation who may feel that they are being forced to take care for their parents. The opposition also might argue that the law could lead to resentment and strained relationship between parents and children, particularly if the relationship between the two parties is already strained. The opposition team might argue that alternative solutions, such as providing financial or social support for the elderly parents, such as explore instead of legally binding children to take care of their parents. And for the last question, how could this law impact relationship between parents and children? Would it create resentment or strain in this relationship, especially if the child is forced to take care of their parents who was abusive and neglectful in the past? The government team may argue that legally binding children to take care of their parents would strengthen the relationship between parents and children by promoting filial piety and the sense of familial duty. They may also argue that the law could help to prevent neglect and abuse of elderly parents, as children will be legally obligated to provide care. Additionally, they may argue that provisions could be made in the law to protect children from having to take care of abused or neglectful parents, such as provision for automatic care arrangement for extension. Last, for the opposition team may argue that legally binding children to take care of their parents could create resentment or strain in relationship, particularly if the child is forced to take care of a parent who was abusive and neglectful in the past. They may argue that this could lead to feeling of anger, frustration, and resentment that could ultimately damage family relationship. The opposition team might also argue that it is unfair to force children to take care of their parents who may have been abusive or neglectful in the past, and that alternative care arrangement should be explored instead. They may also argue that the law could be difficult to enforce and that it may be better to focus on providing support and resources for elderly parents and their families. Well, that's all the question and answer that should be provided in this motion. I hope that this video or this post debate analysis can help you guys to improve your argument for the next competition. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terus aku nggak tahu cara menyudahi ini. Post recording pas stop ya.